Hi there. This video is addressing the issue of capital punishment, and as always we are using our motif of archery, that the doing moral philosophy or doing ethics is comparable to aiming at the bullseye, the target, and trying to hit it, and that target being, in the case of ethics, the good, the right, or what we ought to do. So when we're addressing capital punishment in this class, we have two authors that we read articles from, the one John Stuart Mill and the other one Hugo Adam Bedau. And the first one, being Mill, is what we're going to deal with on this video. So just something that's a point of interest is that both Immanuel Kant and G.W.F. Hegel, two of the most famous of philosophers across time, they thought that execution is required to preserve the convicted murderer's dignity as a rational moral agent. What do they mean by that? Well, they mean that if you, instead of putting the person to death, if you put them in not in solitary confinement, but if you put them in prison for the rest of their life, they no longer have any autonomy. They are they're controlled by other people for the rest of their life. Ernest van den Haag, formerly the head of the law department, he died in 2002, the law department at Fordham University, he addresses this. He says they thought that execution, when deserved, is required. So deserved would mean they've committed a capital offense, but it's required for the sake of the convict's dignity. And then he expresses what they're saying. Does not life imprisonment violate human dignity more than execution by keeping alive a prisoner deprived of all autonomy? So that loss of freedom for all the rest of your life is worse than the death penalty, is what they're saying. This is John Stuart Mill's speech in defense of capital punishment. He gave it, what you read, back in 1868 when he's speaking for his position, which is one of opposition to doing away with the death penalty. Now that's strange and that's interesting because you've already seen that Mill and Bentham, who influenced Mill, that both men were very progressive. Both of them were for LGBT rights, as we would call it today, although they didn't call it that back then, but they were for LGBT rights at a time when to live out that type of sexuality could land you in jail, could get you a prison sentence. And they also were for women having the vote, which was a very revolutionary thing. They wanted women to be treated as equals to men. So it's not typical in our day that we would find progressives being opposed to the death penalty, but he was. So these are just excerpts from the speech. It's not the entire speech. He says, when there has been brought home to anyone by conclusive evidence the greatest crime known to the law, which would be heinous murder, when that's been brought home to them, and when the attendant circumstances suggest no palliation of the guilt, there's no extenuating circumstances, no hope that the culprit may even yet not be unworthy to live among mankind, that perhaps they could be rehabilitated, nothing to make it probable that the crime was an exception to his general character rather than a consequence of it, then I confess it appears to me that to deprive the criminal of the life of which he has proved himself to be unworthy by taking somebody else's life, solemnly to blot him out from the fellowship of mankind and from the catalogue of the living, is the most appropriate, as it is certainly the most impressive. It makes an impression on people's minds. It's the most appropriate and most impressive mode in which society can attach to so great a crime the penal consequences which for the security of life it is indispensable to annex to it. And so in order to keep people's lives secure and not have them fearing being put to death by murderers, we have to make it that murder is, and especially heinous murder, is a crime that's severely punished. I defend this penalty, he says, when confined to atrocious cases on the very ground on which it is commonly attacked, on that of humanity to the criminal, as beyond comparison the least cruel mode in which it's possible adequately to deter from the crime. So he does think that punishment should deter from crime. He says this is the least cruel mode by which we can do that. If in our horror of inflicting death we endeavor to devise some punishment for the living criminal which shall act on the human mind with a deterrent force at all comparable to that of death, we are driven to inflictions less severe indeed in appearance, they look like they're less severe, and therefore less efficacious, they accomplish less, but far more cruel in reality. He says if you look at life imprisonment, that's actually more cruel. Few, I think, would venture to propose as a punishment for aggravated murder less than imprisonment with hard labor for life. That is the fate to which a murderer would be consigned by the mercy which shrinks from putting him to death. But has it been sufficiently considered what sort of a mercy this is, and what kind of life it leaves to him? If indeed the punishment is not really inflicted, if it becomes the sham which a few years ago such punishments were rapidly becoming, so that what would happen is people could be easily paroled, then indeed its adoption would be almost tantamount to giving up the attempt to repress murder altogether. I mean, if people can get away with murder, it's disheartening, and it means that it's not going to be, your penal system is not going to be an inhibitor to murder. But if it really is what it professes to be, and if it is realized in all its rigor by the popular imagination, as it very probably would not be, but as it must be if it is to be efficacious, it will be so shocking that when the memory of the crime is no longer fresh, there will be almost insuperable difficulty in executing it. So you can't follow through if it's not that it's fresh in the mind what they did. What comparison can there really be in point of severity between consigning a man to the short pang of a rapid death and immuring him in a living tomb, there to linger out what may be a long life in the hardest and most monotonous toil without any of its alleviations or rewards, debarred from all pleasant sights and sounds, and cut off from all earthly hope except a slight mitigation of bodily restraint or a small improvement of diet? Yet even such a loss as this, because there is no one moment at which the suffering is of terrifying intensity, and above all, because it does not contain the element so imposing to the imagination of the unknown, meaning of death, Shakespeare called death that unknown country, going a journey to an unknown country. It doesn't contain that element. It is universally reputed a milder punishment than death, stands in all codes as a mitigation of the capital penalty, and is thankfully accepted as such. For it is characteristic of all punishments which depend on duration for their efficacy, imprisonment, all therefore which are not corporal, they're not bodily or pecuniary, they're not monetary, they're not financial, that they are more rigorous than they seem. He's saying it's worse. Life in prison is worse than it appears to be, while it is, on the contrary, one of the strongest recommendations a punishment can have, that it should seem more rigorous than it is. For its practical power depends far less on what it is than on what it seems. So the death penalty seems worse, but he says it's actually kinder, and life imprisonment seems better, but it's actually crueler. There is not, I should think, any human infliction which makes an impression on the imagination so entirely out of proportion to its real severity as the punishment of death. Because if you think about it, in his day it was hanging primarily. If you were in France, it would have been beheading. But that it's over pretty fast. The punishment must be mild indeed, which does not add more to the sum of human misery than is necessary or directly added by the execution of a criminal. Now he's speaking to one of his fellow members of Parliament. As my honourable friend, the member for Northampton, Mr. Gilpin, has himself remarked, the most that human law can do to anyone in the matter of death is to hasten it. The man would have died at any rate. He's going to die anyway. Not so very much later, and on the average, I fear, with a considerably greater amount of bodily suffering. He's going to get the death penalty on the installment plan, he's saying. Society's asked then to denude itself, to give up, to just throw away, an instrument of punishment which, in the grave cases to which alone it is suitable, effects its purposes at a less cost of human suffering than any other, which, while it inspires more terror, is actually, he says, less cruel in actual fact than any punishment that we should think of substituting for it. He's really thinking this is a mercy. I mean, you put dogs down, he's saying putting a human down is a mercy. My honorable friend says that it does not inspire terror, and that experience proves it to be a failure. But he doesn't find that to be an argument that's persuasive against the death penalty. So that's one of the arguments against it that you've heard in the recordings you've heard. Like, for instance, Jeremy Irons speaking against it and saying it doesn't bring about a reduction in murder or in violent crime. He says, but the influence of a punishment is not to be estimated by its effect on hardened criminals. That's interesting. Those whose habitual way of life keeps them, so to speak, at all times within sight of the gallows, those who are career criminals, do grow to care less about it, as, to compare good things with bad, an old soldier is not much affected by the chance of dying in battle. In other words, just like a soldier gets used to the imminence of death, a criminal gets used to the imminence of the possibility of the death penalty, and he or she becomes desensitized to it. I can afford, he goes on, he says, to admit all that is often said about the indifference of professional criminals to the gallows. Though of that indifference, 1/3 is probably bravado, probably they're acting tough when in fact they're not that tough, and another third confidence that they shall have the luck to escape. They figure it's not going to happen to me. It is quite probable that the remaining third is real, but the efficacy of a punishment which acts principally through the imagination is chiefly to be measured by the impression it makes on those who are still innocent. Get Mill's argument here. Mill's saying it doesn't matter the person who's committed this crime, whether or not it makes a difference to them. It's others who see the example. This is teaching by example, and it's also restraint by example. It goes on to say, the rest of that sentence, its impression that it makes on those who are still innocent by the horror with which it surrounds the first promptings of guilt, the restraining influence it exercises over the beginning of the thought, which, if indulged, will become a temptation. So that when the person starts thinking homicidal thoughts, they think, wait, what happened to that guy could happen to me. The check which it exerts over the graded declension towards the state, never suddenly attained, in which crime no longer revolts. So he's saying people don't just suddenly become, capital criminals taking lives, but it's a slow process by which they do that, and punishment no longer terrifies. Much has been said of the sanctity of human life and the absurdity of supposing that we can teach respect for life by ourselves destroying it. But I'm surprised at the employment of this argument, for it is one which might be brought against any punishment whatever, not just the death penalty. It is not human life only, not human life as such that ought to be sacred to us, but human feelings. The human capacity of suffering is what we should cause to be respected, not the mere capacity of existing. And we may imagine somebody asking how we can teach people not to inflict suffering by ourselves inflicting it. But to this, I should answer, all of us would answer, that to deter by suffering from inflicting suffering is not only possible, but the very purpose of penal justice. Does fining a criminal show want of respect for property? Or does imprisoning him show want of respect for personal freedom? Just as unreasonable is it to think that to take the life of a man who's taken that of another is to show want of regard for human life. And then he says it's just the opposite. We show, on the contrary, most emphatically our regard for it, for life, by the adoption of a rule that he who violates that right in another forfeits it for himself. That if I don't treat your life as precious and valuable and I take your life, I've given up my right to life. And that while no other crime that he can commit deprives him of his right to live, this shall, that if I commit murder, then I've forfeited my right to life. There is, though, he says now, one argument against capital punishment, even in extreme cases, which I cannot deny to have weight, on which my honorable friend justly, he's acknowledging that his friend has argued well, he justly laid great stress, and which never can be entirely got rid of. It is this, that if by an error of justice an innocent person is put to death, the mistake can never be corrected. All compensation, all reparation for the wrong is impossible. This would be indeed a serious objection if these miserable mistakes, amongst the most tragical occurrences in the whole round of human affairs, could not be made extremely rare. And folks, for his argument, you live in the age now of DNA testing. So we can test and see whether or not the person's DNA is present. This is a new time. And the evidence and the ways of proving culpability or not proving culpability are the best they've ever been in history. He ends by saying this, I think, sir, that in the case of most offenses, except those against property, there's more need of strengthening our punishment than of weakening them, and that severer sentences, with an apportionment of them to the different kinds of offenses, which shall approve itself better than at present to the moral sentiments of the community, are the kind of reform which our penal system now stands in need. I shall therefore vote against the amendment. He's saying we need to strengthen the law, not weaken the law. That apparently at that point in time in England, the jurisprudential system was seen as not being all that rigorous, and so people were losing respect for it. So when we talk about this idea of an eye for an eye or of taking a life for a life, what's the true point or intention of the law of retribution? That's what lex talionis means. It means the law of retribution. Well, it comes to us from the Jews. It comes from the Old Testament. And it is a concept out of the Torah, out of the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible. So the idea is that the punishment must fit the crime. It's not that you must take a life for a life, or an eye for an eye, or a hand for a hand. It's you can't take any more than that. You can't exact more punishment than is appropriate to the crime. This is Doing Ethics by Vaughan, a textbook I previously used in this course in the past. And he says, lex talionis, the idea that the punishment should match the crime in kind, that justice demands an eye for an eye. He's saying, what's the idea? And he says, should rapists be raped? Should torturers be tortured? And he goes on to say, of course not. That's not what is intended. So the idea is of it setting a limit on punishment, on what can happen. Interestingly, the ancient rabbis, and rabbis down to the present day, tell us that in Israel, actually the lex talionis was not followed as what must happen, but as the maximum of what could happen. And there's not much evidence of them ever having followed through and demanded life for life, eye for eye, and so on. So I'm using this by way of analogy. Right now, when I'm making this video, America is still in the wake of what took place back in the spring when George Floyd died at the hands of police officers, and all the after effects of that. And as I'm making this recording right now, there's still an uproar in Philadelphia, where a young man who is a mental patient, but also who had a history of violent crime and who'd done time in jail, he came out and sought to attack some police with a knife, and he was shot to death. In the wake of that having happened, there have now been over 50 law enforcement officers who've been injured in the backlash that's going on in Philadelphia from him having been killed. So I mention those things to say it's very much on the mind of people in the United States of an officer's response to what he or she is encountering when somebody is behaving in an illegal manner. And you can see with this scale going up that the officer's perception of what's going on is supposed to govern their response. Perception's on the left, response is on the right. So if you have a compliant, if the officer perceives a compliant person, although they've been behaving in a criminal fashion, then he just uses cooperative controls. Going up the ladder, let's jump up to resistant. If he or she perceives that this person is resistant, they need to use compliance techniques. And to jump to the top, if they perceive that that person's assaultive and comes out to you with a weapon, and comes after you, then they're authorized to use deadly force. So the idea in using this scale that we use in law enforcement is to say that this is sort of what's going on in society on a larger scale when we talk about the death penalty. That there's an idea that there ought to be a concomitant response to what the person did. That was what Mill was saying here, that basically the punishment should suit the crime. I want to talk a little bit about Lady Justice. So you've seen all kinds of symbols of Lady Justice, and you recognize that she's got the blindfold and the scales and the sword in her hands, and she appears in many different fashions, especially outside of courthouses around the United States. She's an ancient symbol. She actually dates, as far as when we first find it occurring in history, Justitia, or Lady Justice. We find it that it's Caesar Augustus who first used this symbol to portray Roman jurisprudence during his reign. And that's the turn of the 1st century BC or BCE into our current time as we mark time. So it's the 1st century BC, and then he lived into the early years. I think he died in the year 16 AD or CE, according to how you like to mark time. And so the ancient Romans were greatly concerned with jurisprudence and with the concept of justice. Justitia was representative of a conception of justice which still serves Western civilization right down to the current day. If you're at all familiar with Blackstone's book of English law, which was kind of the Bible of jurisprudence until the middle of the 19th century, it is greatly influenced by Roman law. Notice that she has scales. Back to the picture, that she has scales, right? So you notice that she has scales. This speaks of equity, balance, weighing of the evidence, and fairness that cannot be bought or bribed. Notice, too, that she holds a sword. So the sword is kind of self-explanatory. She represents the power of the state to execute punishment on those who offend against the state and its citizens. And then lastly, notice her blindfold. So the idea there with the blindfold is impartiality in judgment and freedom from bias. Okay, so that's important as far as when we approach this issue. One of the things that gives the law teeth is its ability to have the sword to execute actual judgment. I want to mention just how quickly now how rare capital punishment is. From 1977 through 2005, there was 575,000 murder and non-negligent manslaughters in the United States. From that came 7,072 death sentences. From that came 1,063 executions. And during that time, 1.2% of killings from 1977 to 2005 led to death sentences. That's a very small percentage. And now, so far, from that time, less than 1% of killings have led to an execution, 0.18%. So that's just to be aware. We're not talking about something that happens a lot. So the rest of this is from Ernest van den Haag, the man from Fordham University, of these particular slides. He says, in reality, we cannot know if the excessive suffering caused by capital punishment causes the murderer to suffer more than the victim, unless, like the murderer tortured his or her victim. He goes on to say, really, whether it does or not is not relevant. The thing to remember here is that the victim did not deserve to suffer in the first place. That's right. The person who died at this murderer's hands was innocent, but this person is guilty. He says punishment, regardless of the motivation, is not intended for revenge. It's not intended to revenge, to offset or compensate for the victim's suffering, or to be measured by it. Punishment is to vindicate the law, the fact that the law says one must not do this, and the social order undermined by the crime. So when somebody commits an act like murder, they are undermining human society. John Donne famously wrote a poem in which he says, I think it's called In Memoriam, maybe it's not In Memoriam, but where he talks about when you hear that another person has died, don't send to find out for whom the bell tolls, because it tolls for you, that we're connected to one another, that we're a part of one another. And so that when somebody else has died, it has an effect upon you and me. And that's what van den Haag is saying here. He's saying that this is affecting human society, and human society must take a stand against it. He says this is why a kidnapper's penal confinement is not limited to the period for which he imprisoned his victim, nor is a burglar's confinement meant merely to offset the suffering or harm he caused his victim, nor is it meant only to offset the advantage he gained. He says another argument is that by killing a murderer we encourage, endorse, or legitimize unlawful killing. Yet although all punishments are meant to be unpleasant, it is seldom argued that they legitimize the unlawful imposition of identical unpleasantness. For instance, imprisonment is not thought to legitimize kidnapping. The difference between murder and execution is that the first is unlawful and undeserved, the second a lawful and deserved punishment for an unlawful act. The physical similarities of the punishment to the crime are irrelevant. The relevant difference is not physical, but social. That's where van den Haag wants to ground this. And so he's saying it's not murder, it's society working out justice. Society threatens punishment in order to deter crime, and society imposes punishment in order to make the threats credible. Thus, the threat of punishment for a crime committed is of no use unless the punishment is enforced. Both the threat of punishment and the actual punishment are necessary to deter crime, and the fact that they function as deterrents is sufficient practical justification for them. So this is me now speaking on him, commenting on van den Haag. The thinking here is that when a criminal commits a crime, he or she volunteers to assume the risk of being punished for the crime committed. In a sense, he or she impales themselves upon the normative standards of the society whose laws they chose to disregard. Now, I just want to show you something as far as the world's major religions when it comes to capital punishment. Looking at the world's religions and orders, Christians are numerically the largest percentage of religious people in the world, Muslims the second largest, Hindus the third largest, and Buddhists the fourth largest. And then I've listed on the slides you'll see, I've listed Judaism. So there's only 14.8 million Jews worldwide. Why have I included Judaism? Well, because Judaism is the oldest of the three religions of the book, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And Christianity and Islam come from Judaism. And so the Hebrew scriptures, although they be a small number of the people in the world, are strongly influential. So we're going to just take a look at different scriptures of these different people. We won't look at any Hindu scriptures. The Upanishads and the Vedas are a little bit hard to distill into just a few slides. So the first one is Judaism. This is from the Hebrew Torah, part of their Tanakh, their Bible. Exodus 21:12, he who strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. And Leviticus is also the Torah, the first 5 books. Leviticus 24, if a man takes the life of any human being, he shall surely be put to death. Then turning to Christianity, in the book of Romans, the epistle to the Romans in the New Testament, it says, for rulers, that means kings or governors or whoever is the dictators, are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it, government, is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing. Think of Lady Justice. For it does not bear the sword for nothing. It is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. That's Christianity. That's the same religion that has, turn the other cheek and forgive and all those things. It talks about government being there in order to exact this punishment. This is from Islam and from the Quran. There's from different writings in Islam here. Whoever slays a soul, unless it be for manslaughter or for anarchy in the land, it is as though he slew all men, and whoever keeps it alive, it is as though he kept alive all men. And here, do not kill the soul which Allah has forbidden, except for the requirements of justice. That's giving permission for there to be capital punishment. This he has enjoined you with, that you may understand. Now this is a famous, well-known imam. He says, the views of American Muslims on the death penalty vary somewhat, but the range is narrow compared to the enormous disagreements amongst Christians. All Muslims accept the permissibility of the death penalty because it is addressed in the Quran. However, our views range from those who would apply it for a moderately short list of crimes to those who would apply it to a somewhat shorter list still, and finally to those who would call for a moratorium on the death penalty in America altogether, which from a Muslim perspective, those would be much more liberal Muslims. This is the Dhammapada. I jumped over Hinduism. Hinduism is larger than Buddhism, and Buddhism comes from Hinduism, like Christianity and Islam come from Judaism. It says here, whoever harms with violence those who are gentle and innocent, to one of these 10 states that person quickly descends. He would beget severe suffering, deprivation and fracturing of the body, or grave illness too, mental imbalance, trouble from the government, cruel slander, loss of relatives, or obstruction of property. Karma, in other words. Houses destroyed by ravaging fire, and then this statement, upon dissolution of the body, that ignorant man is born in hell. You can see that this is an idea of retribution to the one who's done this. So Tomoko Sasaki, a well-known Japanese Buddhist, says, a basic teaching in Japanese Buddhism is retribution. If someone evil does something bad, he has to atone for it with his life. So just to wrap up, one of the things that is missing in American jurisprudence for the most part is the idea of restitution, of somehow undoing or making up for the damage that we have done, and to help somehow pay my debt to society. One of the things that's really important that we would see in somebody who has committed a capital crime is genuine remorse. Oftentimes it's not there. And the thing to be hoped for is that there's the potential for that person for some form of redemption. If you want to see a film that really gets into it, it's an older film, or read a book about it. In the film, it's Burt Lancaster who portrays him, but it's a true story. It's called The Birdman of Alcatraz. It's a man who tried to make something of his life, even though he was sentenced to life in prison. And we'll end there.